Tutorial, we're going to be making a simple calculator in Python. This is going to be a text-based calculator. You'll be able to enter any equation, you'll be able to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and you'll be able to clear the screen, and this will teach you a lot about functions and stuff like that. So in our Python file, let's just start creating some functions for add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So we'll define add. You'll pass in num1 and num2, and then we can just return num1 plus num2. Next we will do define subtract, and they'll pass in num1 and num2. This is similar, we will also just return num1, but it's minus num2 instead of add, and then we'll define multiply, and we will return the multiplied value. Lastly, we will do divide 1 and num2, and this is going to be slightly different because we need this program to know that it can't divide by 0, because if we actually just comment this out and I try to print, let's just say, 3 divided by 0 or something, and when we try to run this, we get an error. And we don't want to get an error because the user will be confused and they'll stop using the program. We want no errors, obviously. So instead of doing that, instead of just giving it an error and making them rerun the program, we will check to see if it's 0. So we'll do if num2 is not 0, so we'll see if it's not 0, and we will return num1 divided by num2. So that's what would happen if it's not 0. And then if it is 0, meaning else, we will return error division by 0 is not allowed. Okay, so we have our functions ready, and now we can just scroll down and create a dictionary. So this dictionary will be a dictionary of operations. So we'll set this to operations, and the variable name is actually going to be all caps. So in programming languages, when there is a variable that is a final, meaning it is not changed throughout the entire program, it is all caps. Now in Python, there's no feature that allows us to actually make a variable uneditable further in the program, but it's still conventional in Python to make variables that are treated as constants all caps. Even though we're only treating it like a final variable, meaning we're never changing it throughout the program, we're still going to have an all caps just so that we know that it's a final, even though it doesn't exist in Python. If that doesn't make sense, all I'm saying is we're not going to change this, and so when you're not going to change a variable ever in the program, just make it all caps. Of course you don't have to, but it's conventional. So we'll do an addition sign, and we'll assign that to add. And so you might think, okay, well, what is add? What is that? We're actually referencing the function add up here. That's what that is. And so subtract will go to subtract, multiply will go to multiply, and lastly divide will go to divide. And so these are all the functions. And note that I'm not putting the parentheses here or anything like that. We're just putting the name. So now we have our basics done. So now it's time to actually create a loop that will allow us to keep asking them over and over. Because if you notice, a calculator allows you to keep asking it questions. It doesn't just stop working when you answer one question. So we don't want to have to keep making the user rerun the program. We want them to keep on asking it. And this will also help us make it so that if there's an error, we just ask them again. So this will actually be an infinite loop because they can just stop the program if they want. So we'll do while true, and we'll set equation to input, enter your equation. And we'll check first to see if the equation is clear. So I know that clear isn't actually an equation, but we are going to check if they want to clear the screen first. And we're actually going to pass on this. So if you know, pass is just a placeholder for when you're programming. If you don't want to enter what's in the if statement yet, if you just want to go to the next part of your code first. So we're not going to deal with this yet. So down here we will just process the user's equation. So for every operator, so an operator is just one of these if you're not familiar with that. So for every operator, that's just a variable we are just creating for this for loop in operations.keys. So if you remember, the .keys method for a dictionary gives you all of the keys, or the first values, of the dictionary. And so for every one of these, we are going to check to see if the operator is in the equation. So if operator is in the equation, then we will do stuff. And if you notice, you can use this operator variable because we're inside this for loop. For every iteration or movement through this for loop, operator is set to the next one. So the first time it's set to addition. The next time it's set to the string subtraction, and then the string multiplication, and then the string division. So this will run 4 times, always. If that is actually in the equation, then we will unpack num1 and num2 from equation.split operator. And so what this is doing is we are splitting the equation where the operator is. So we're not including that. We are splitting this. So if we had a string, right, and it was 1 plus 1, the .split method splits the string. So it takes this out and splits the string into a list. So this is a list of 2 items now. And so we're only assuming that the user will enter 2 numbers so far. If they entered more than 1, we would get an error here, but we're going to learn about try and except in a minute or two, which is a feature that will let us check for an error, and if an error happens, then we'll do something else. But for now, we're just going to unpack num1 and num2. Because if you remember, you can unpack items in a list or tuple into variables. So when you split this, for example, if I gave the 1 plus 1 example, when we split this, we will put the first item into num1, and then the second item into num2. So that's what the unpacking is, if you remember. Then we'll set both of these to the float version of num1. And if you remember, we did this with int, but we want to actually set this to float so that the user can enter, for example, 2.3 plus 4.5, or something like that. Because if you put a dot here, when you're trying to convert this to an integer, you would get an error, because there's no decimal point in integers, so that's why we're setting these both to floats. And so here's where the confusion will come in with the error. So like I said, we're going to learn about a new feature in Python. 1 plus 1, it's working so far. We didn't actually do an operation with it yet, so it's working completely fine. But if we have multiple, this will split the string into 3 items. And here we get a value error. Too many values to unpack. And it expected 2 because there's only 2 variables here. So in this program, we're only going to allow them to enter 2 values. So we can easily fix this by doing a try and except statement. If I comment all of this code out to show you what a try and except statement is, let's just scroll all the way down, and we can say try. You can enter code in here, and if there's an error, meaning except, then we'll do the error code. And so by try, we mean, okay, well, let's try it. Let's see if it'll give us an error. If it doesn't give us an error, meaning we run all the code that's in here, we'll skip the except. So it's kind of like an if-else, but for errors. And so if we had, if we just tried to convert this into a float, right? If we try to convert this to a float, we would definitely get an error. And so, for example, instead of getting a big error, we could say something simple like an error occurred. Because instead, if we actually ran this code and just did x equals float and then a bunch of random letters, we'd get an actual big error, and the user would not want to see all this because they'd be really confused. But if we use the try and except statement, we can just tell them an error occurred, because we are customizing what happens when an error happens. And so this is also another form of control flow. And so we're doing this inside our program. There could be an error with this, right? Too many values to unpack if they did 1 plus 1 plus 1 instead of just 1 plus 1. Or with this, there could also be a value error if they entered something weird in between the numbers. So maybe we did 2 plus 2, right? It says you can't convert the string to a float because this isn't a float, so that doesn't make sense, right? So it gives us a value error. So all 3 of these lines are prone to value errors. To solve this, we'll just do try, and then indent this code block, and then except, and then we will do something else. Now there is a better way to do this. Instead of just saying accept, we can actually choose which kinds of errors to accept. So let's accept only value errors, because if there's a different kind of error while we're writing our program, we're not going to know what the error actually is, because if we just accepted all errors, we would just know that some kind of weird error occurred. But if we only accept value errors and make so that value errors are okay, then we'll know that all the other errors are our fault and not the user's fault. So here let's do something else, right? Let's tell them that they entered an invalid input. Please be sure to enter only one operation, like 1 plus 1 and not 1 plus 1 plus 1. And make sure we actually say continue after this, because we're going to be writing more code after this, but we don't want it to print this and then continue on with the operation, because that wouldn't work. It would just print this and not do anything about it. So we're going to continue back to the top of the loop and ask them again. Okay, so that's doing well. Next, let's actually just test this and see if it works. So we can enter 1 plus 1, that works. 1 space plus space 1 works. 1 plus space 1 works. All variants of spaces work. Let's try something that wouldn't work, like 1 plus 1 plus 1. Okay, that works, good thing. Now let's test to see if the float conversion won't work with the value error as well. So we'll do 1 at or hash or anything really, 1 plus 1, right? Okay, there we go. So everything is working completely fine. So that's good. Now we actually have to calculate the answer using the correct operation from the dictionary. So this code that I'm about to write might seem really confusing, but don't worry. It'll actually make sense once I explain it. So we'll just type answer, and we'll set that to operations, and then we'll reference the operator. So what this means is we're setting answer so far to the operator of operations. And so we could just say operator of plus, right? But we are checking to see every single operator. So that's 4 of them. And so the first time this will be plus, the second time operator will be minus, the third time it'll be multiplication, and the fourth time it will be division. And so we don't know which one it is at this point in the loop, so we'll just say operator. And so what this is actually, this returns the function. So with this, we don't have to actually run the function again outside of this line, like, for example, add or something like that. We don't have to do all sorts of if statements. All we have to do is just treat it like a function, so pretend that this is add or subtract or multiply, right? And we'll just pass in num1 and num2. So if this still is confusing to you, what this is saying is we're just getting whichever one this is. So if operator happened to be minus, we would be referencing minus, which would end up giving us subtract. And so Python would evaluate this as just being replaced with subtract. And now this actually looks like the function we wrote. But we don't know which one we're at in the for loop, so we enter this. Now we'll just print out the answer so that they can finally see their answer, and then we will break. So we will exit this for loop because we don't need to check for more operations because there's only supposed to be one and we already calculated it. So we can break out of this for loop. And so now we can actually just test out our code. 1 plus 1, okay. 1 plus 1 with spaces works. 3.4 plus 1 is 4.4. 3 times 3 is 9, okay. 2 divided by 2 is 1, alright. 4 times 4, 8 minus 3, alright, everything is working very well. So, but now let's actually see what happens if we were to write an equation without either add, subtract, multiply, or divide. So this loop would go through it 4 times, and it wouldn't find any of these in our string. Well, what if we did that? We just typed 1, right? Okay, right now, it's actually pretty okay. We're just repeating the loop and asking us again. But we should actually display the user some information about why it did that, right? So before this for loop, let's create a variable called count and set that to 1. And after every iteration, it will add it by 1 to see which one this is currently on. And so after every iteration, of course, we will increment count by 1. And before this, we will check to see if the count is 4, meaning if the count is divide, but this if statement has clearly not executed because we didn't break out of the loop, so it moves down because this is false, so none of this was executed, so we move down to here. And now we can check if the count's 4, meaning it's divide. Then we will print invalid input, please enter a valid equation. This is because they entered none of these. Alright, so let's test this out. 1, okay, that's good, so it works now. Now our last bit we need to add is the clear feature, because right now it doesn't do anything, and we just pass, meaning we just don't do anything at all in this if statement. So how do you clear the screen in any terminal window? So let's just get out of this program for a second. If you are on a computer that is Unix-like, meaning you are macOS or any Linux distribution, Typing clear in the terminal window will just clear the screen. And on Windows, it is CLS. But of course, that's not working for me because I'm not using Windows. So I type clear, okay? And if we want to enter terminal commands, most of the time, if you haven't changed the shell of your computer, most of the time you're using either bash or ZSH. These are scripting languages that are used by the terminal window. If you don't understand this, that's completely fine. But the command in this language to clear the screen is clear. If we want to access this scripting language within Python, we will actually have to import a module called OS, stands for operating system. And so in here we can just say os.system, so this means we're ready to enter a command, and inside this we will pass in a string that contains the command we would like to enter. And so I'll type clear, and I'm pretty sure on Windows you'll type CLS, but I don't use Windows, so I can't be completely certain that that's how os.system will work on your computer, but for me, I'll do clear. Alright, so there we go. You might think that this works, but we actually just have to continue through the loop first, because otherwise it'll still go through here and it'll say invalid input. So we have to continue back to the top of the while true loop. Okay, so let's enter this. We can enter a bunch of random stuff, right? And then type clear, and it cleared our screen. Nice. Okay, so this is our simple calculator app. And it's very simple, as you can see, but it taught you about functions and their parameters. You got a refresher on some basic mathematical operations. You use a lot of if statements, a dictionary. You learned about how constants are in Python, even though they technically don't exist, but we can treat them as constants. We learned that you can actually access functions through a dictionary by actually referencing the item and then just calling it with the parentheses here. And we learned about try and accept. So if you took anything away from this, I hope that you took try and accept, because try and accept is the newest thing we have learned about so far in this course. So if you're liking this Python course so far, please consider subscribing to my channel. It would really help me a lot, and it would motivate me to keep making more videos like this.